Merci de vous joindre à nous aujourd'hui pour ce webinaire. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us for this webinar with our speaker today, Judd Devermont. I'm very happy to welcome all of you. I am Alexandra de Scheffer. I'm the director of the German Marshall Fund of the United States in Paris. And this event is part of a program called the U.S. Speakers Series, which we run in partnership with the U.S. Embassy in France, in Paris. And this program aims at having American experts, officials, former officials, congressmen, congresswomen, academics, provide key insights into U.S. foreign policy priorities. And to help French, European audiences, and more broadly transatlantic audiences gain a better understanding of the dynamics that guide US policies and the implications for transatlantic cooperation, which is really at the heart of what GMF does on both sides of the Atlantic. We have been looking at three key themes these last few months. The first one dealt with the US-China competition. We had a really great bipartisan conversation. The second theme was around the US elections, where we tried to look in a prospective way the role of the US Congress in shaping and influencing US foreign policies. And today we will be looking at US policy in Africa and more broadly how geopolitics play into this region. And to discuss these issues, we're really happy to have Judd Devermont as the main speaker today. Judd Devermont is the current director of the Africa program at the CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. His expertise includes Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, US policy in the region, China's strategic aims in the region, but also more recently, the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic in the Africa region, but also in how it is changing the relationships between African governments and external partners. Before joining CSIS, Judd Devermont served in many US governmental positions as the National Intelligence Officer for Africa, where he led the US intelligence community's analytic efforts on sub-Saharan African issues. Before that, from 2013 to 2015, he was the CIA's senior political analyst on sub-Saharan Africa. And from 2011 to 2013, he served as the NSC's director for Somalia, Nigeria, the Sahel, and the African Union. And in that position, he contributed to the US strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa signed by President Obama in 2012. So to introduce this topic, I mean, what's really interesting, at least from a European perspective, he's sitting here in Paris, where obviously the French government has a strong interest in the region. The French armies are present in the Sahel in counterterrorism operations, very closely coordinating with Americans as well. But there seems to be a shift, and Judd, we're very eager to hear your views on that. There seems to be a shift in the US policy under the Biden administration. The Biden administration has repetitively said, you know, America is back. It has been very clear for the transatlantic relationship. The question we might want to ask ourselves today is, what does it mean for Africa? So far, the Biden administration has set a very different tone, has been pretty obvious in emphasizing the importance of renewing and strengthening US foreign policy in Africa, including in the Sahel. This has included positive language about seeking deeper ties to the continent, supporting African institutions, and also engaging in a variety of issues that go beyond security, military, counterterrorism policy. You've seen that these few last days or weeks with a more hands-on approach in Ethiopia. on the human rights issues, the travel of Senator Chris Coons to Ethiopia to convey President Biden's concern about the humanitarian crisis and human rights abuses in the Tigray region, but also the risk of broader instability in the Horn of Africa. There is also an obvious willingness to be more active in the Horn of Africa region, a great deal of concern for the security crisis in Mozambique, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, with already a concrete re-engagement or greater involvement in Mozambique, where U.S. special forces will begin training Mozambican security forces. And all of that takes place in the broader geopolitical context of an increasing Chinese influence, which obviously plays an important role in shaping and reshaping U.S. engagement in Africa. It was very striking to see how the Trump administration saw Africa primarily as a battlefield for the larger geostrategic competition with China. Will this continue under the Biden administration seems to be also an important question to ask. And it's not just about the growing Chinese influence, there's also Russia, Turkey, and many other powers. And so the region's geopolitics seems to de facto favor closer collaboration between Europe and the United States as a time where both sides of the Atlantic share some quite common concerns. So to discuss these issues and many other issues, I'm very happy to leave the floor to Judd Devermont, who will make some opening remarks, and then we will immediately open the floor to comments or questions. And from the technical and from a technical standpoint, please use the Q&A box that you have at the bottom of your screen, and we will be able to take your questions and comments and have Judd answer them or contradict them. So Judd, the floor is yours. Thank you again for being with us today.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to the German Marshall Fund and the U.S. Embassy in Paris for inviting me to discuss U.S. policy in Africa. I'm really excited to engage with you on this topic about both what the current direction of the Biden administration is and how I think they need to meet the moment and then beyond. I'm going to try to share a PowerPoint. We'll cross our fingers and hopefully this works. I don't think that worked. Now you know all my points. Okay. What do you see now? Do you see the PowerPoint?
We see it, but it would be nice to put the slideshow mode to have it in a bigger format if you can do so.
Yep. Okay, now
Perfect.
we're good. Perfect. We've only been doing Zoom for a year plus, but I'm finally getting the hang of it. So this is my thoughts on reimagining U.S. policy in Africa. And the bottom line is that the Biden administration really does have an opportunity here to renew its relationship with sub-Saharan African countries, as well as its external partners, but it can and should do more. This is a chance to reinvigorate and re-energize a policy that quite frankly has been stuck in amber for almost 3 decades. Priority, of course, will be to reverse some of the negative, counterproductive Trump policies, but in many ways, that's the easy part. The true test is whether the Biden administration will go further, will break with past practices and set a new course for a dynamic relationship with an evolving continent. Now, what this is going to require is the president's time and attention. That's a very hard ask considering all the challenges that President Biden has to deal with, but it's also going to require some fortitude and some creativity if we're really going to move forward. So to kickstart our conversation, I'm going to talk a little bit about where we've been and then a little bit about where we're going, including some of my own thoughts on where we could be more innovative. So let's start with the bipartisan consensus. This is a term that we use in Washington essentially to mean that at least after the Cold War, and I know I do have some Cold War photos here, but I couldn't help myself. But in general, since the end of the Cold War, starting with President Clinton, there has been a general consensus around how U.S. policy towards Africa should look, around 4 pillars, which is promoting democracy, advancing peace and security, increasing trade and investment, focusing on development. That key partners were going to be the UK and France and the European Union, that we are going to work through some of the anchor states, Nigeria, Kenya, Ethiopia, and South Africa. And then each administration was going to have 1 or 2 signature initiatives. So under President Clinton, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which was a unilateral trade preferences, that continues today. Under President Bush, the PEPFAR, which is a big AIDS program, as well as the Millennium Challenge Corporation. And then under President Obama, you had the Young African Leaders Initiative, as well as Power Africa. And each of these administrations have really embraced those preceding initiatives and preceding policies, and then sort of added to it or made it their own. And this bipartisanship is both in the executive branch as well as in the legislative branch, where on both sides of the aisle, there's a committed group of legislators, senators, and representatives who focus on Africa and concretize some of these initiatives in law. Now, the Biden administration was a little different. At least it intended to be this big break, this discontinuity. I would characterize the Trump administration policy as neglectful, as mean-spirited, and as China obsessed. So neglectful, President Trump met with fewer Africans in the Oval Office than any other president in his first term, starting with President Kennedy. He met with President Kenyatta twice, and he met with President Buhari once. In general, he was not interested in African issues. And if you read some of the sort of memoirs of former members of his cabinet, you can see how uninterested and questioning he was about why we were even engaged in Africa. Mean-spirited, I don't have to repeat the expletives, but we know about some of the things he said about African countries and African people, and then instituting travel bans on countries like Somalia, Nigeria, briefly Chad, Eritrea, Tanzania. Also denigrated his partnerships with transatlantic partnerships with the Europeans, and was in general not very complimentary of the Africans he did meet. And finally, China obsessed. This is the one animating idea within this administration, much more so than counterterrorism. John Bolton, his former national security advisor, must have mentioned China a dozen times in the big speech that introduced the Africa policy, and rarely actually talked about specific issues on the continent outside of China and to a smaller extent, Russia. Now, I do want to give them at least credit for one thing, which is there was a focus on trade and investment. They created a new initiative called Prosper Africa, which is a coordinating mechanism to increase U.S. trade. They also began the negotiations with Kenya on a free trade agreement, and they doubled the budget for OPIC, the Overseas Investment Private Corporation, from 30 billion to 60 billion. Now that's called the DFC, the Development Finance Corporation. For all the things that President Trump tried to do, in many ways, it wasn't as bad as it could have been, because there was a number of elements of the American system committed to the bipartisan consensus. That was Congress, the diplomats, and I would also argue the American people. So at the end of the Trump administration, we saw a neglectful approach towards Africa. Certainly, he had damaged U.S. reputation, but in some respects, the guardrails remained. Now, Biden administration comes into power, and we're really talking about a back to the future moment. The Biden team is clearly committed to restoring the bipartisan consensus. I mean, if you look at the key players that he's brought back into his government, whether it is Linda Thomas Greenfield, who was a former Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, and now she's our ambassador to the UN. Ambassador Samantha Power is going to be at USAID. Gail Smith, who was the head of USAID under President Obama, is now going to be the coordinator for for COVID diplomacy, for vaccine diplomacy. So a number of the same players. We have seen engagement at the highest levels from President Biden doing a video call to the African Union. I haven't counted up all of them yet, but if you took Biden, Secretary Blinken, and National Security Advisor Sullivan calls, we may be at a point where it's already been more than the entirety of the Trump administration in terms of high-level engagement, at least in terms of phone calls. We've seen a promotion of democracy and governance, something that was severely lacking at the national level under President Trump. We saw strong statements about Uganda and Ethiopia, and of course, a recommitment to multilateralism, rejoining the WHO, committing to the UN, supporting Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala as the head of the WTO. So in all of those respects, I think we're talking about a restoration, a return, this back to the future moment. But as I said, we have to do more than that. The continent is changing. It is not the same continent of 4 years ago. And clearly it's not the same continent that the policies of the last 30 years have been sort of anchored on. And so Biden has talked about a couple of new initiatives. One of them will be around climate change. That's a huge priority globally. There's going to be a summit at the end of this month where we know 5 African leaders are going to be invited, presidents of Gabon, DRC, Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. And I think we'll see more from the Biden administration on climate. This is a commitment from this administration on diaspora engagement. You can just look at the number of Nigerian Americans in very senior roles in this government, not just on Africa policy, but across the spectrum. And I think there'll be more there. And finally, something that I'm very excited about, there will be an urbanization initiative, at least that was pledged during the campaign. The continent is increasingly urbanizing. And I think for too long, the US government has thought of it as rural, as agricultural. But here's the big question. How much time and attention can President Biden truly give to Africa? COVID and the economy are going to be priorities 1 and 1 in terms of his focus. And you do need the president's engagement for that high level touch, as well as to push boundaries. I think there's a couple other questions that we have to see how it's going to land. One is going to be on security. There's a big review right now of our security posture. President Trump pulled out 700 troops from Somalia. He also reduced the number of troops in West Africa. What will the Biden administration, how will they approach that issue? I think is to be seen. And then there's this balance between affirmative policies like urbanization or climate change and just the tyranny of the urgent. And clearly Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa is taking a tremendous amount of time of the Africa policymakers, as it should. We will see if Mozambique has the same effect. But if you're just responding to crises all the time, it's hard to move the needle forward. Now, for me, I think that we have to do a lot more to have a innovative policy that recognizes that Africa, that demographically the future is African, with the population is going to double from 1.3 billion to 2.6 billion by 2050, that Nigeria will be the 3rd largest country in the world, surpassing the United States, that, as I said already, it's rapidly urbanizing. This is a picture, if you haven't recognized it, of Burna Boy, who is a Nigerian pop star and who is changing the way our entertainment works. And we need to be better than where we are right now. So what I would recommend is that Africa can't be an afterthought. As much as I come from a background where I've worked Africa policy my whole life, this can't be just the place where Africa policymakers engage. That we need to think about Africa in an integrated global discussion. We need to, when we get to these different summits, whether it's the climate summit or the democracy summit, that Africans aren't a sideshow, that they're not tokens, that they are actually integrated into these conversations. We can think smartly about our partnerships with other countries, external partners, not only doing summits like we have in the past, and we think that the Biden administration will do a summit like they did in 2014, but also how do you partner in new ways? With trilaterals, for example, or replicating the quad structure that is in East Asia, but in Africa? How do we think of division of labor or division of responsibilities between us, the United States, Africans, and our European partners, particularly around the Sahel. I'd like to see our government, my government, commit more to the Continental Free Trade Agreement. Under Trump, there was sort of a distance to it. The Biden administration seems open to it, but we could do a lot more. And then this issue around China, and the Trump administration, as we mentioned, was obsessed with China, made everything about China. The Biden administration so far is, as I think, thinking about China as a strategic threat, as a strategic challenge. But you can see from some of the leaders, including Secretary Blinken, talking about how do we compete, how do we contest, how do we challenge, how do we counter when we need to, and how will that react to in Africa? For most Africans, they will say, we do not want to see another Cold War in Africa. They don't want the U.S. to be the partner of choice. They want a choice of partners. And so I think taking the Africans at their word, we have to ask them to do more. What do they want from their partners? What's the transparency that they want in investments? What's the kind of ways that they want to think about standards? I understand the rhetoric, but we need to move forward and get to a place where we can actually have constructive engagement with the Africans, constructive competition with world rivals. And then finally, we need to invest in storytelling. We need to end these simplistic narratives about Africa. You may know that the American media is often very negative about Africa, and U.S. policymakers don't help by talking largely about crises or then bucketing African leaders in good and bad categories, which I think is very problematic. Finally, our greatest strength, what has kept us going over the last 4 years, is our people-to-people engagement. And I'd like to see the administration double down on that. There could be opportunities for a Black Lives Matter activist to talk to an End SARS activist in Nigeria. But, government can get out of the way in some of these cases and just have the American people and African counterparts engaged to talk honestly about the challenges in both countries and societies around democracy, around misinformation, around economic inequality, around police brutality. And I think that honest approach is probably the best way to move forward. So I've put a lot of ideas on the table, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Judd. That was extremely insightful as always, and we already have a lot of questions. Actually, we have two similar questions on the Belt and Road Initiative. So the first question is reminding what Linda Thomas Greenfield, which you mentioned in your presentation, said during one of her hearing before the Senate, where she presented China as the strategic adversary of the United States. And on the African continent, she pleaded to offer an alternative to China and its investment strategy that has plunged African countries into colossal debt. And so the question was, what could be the American alternative? What could be the alternative at a time where we've heard, the President Biden talking of the urgency to find Belt and Road alternative, including in the Indo-Pacific and on other continents where China has deeply invested. And the other linked question I have to that was, what can the U.S. do maybe to capitalize on China's Belt and Road Initiative and structure projects in Africa, as opposed to trying to counter them? So I'll regroup them and let you respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree that China is the strategic challenge for the United States. In sub-Saharan Africa, at the same time, and Ambassador Thomas Greenfield mentioned this, that Chinese are answering African needs in terms of infrastructure. 130 billion to 170 billion is their infrastructure needs per annum, according to the African Development Bank. And China is trading with Africa at about 180 billion to 200 billion a year. The U.S. trade is about 40 billion. So there's a huge gap between what we do and what China does. So I have a couple of things that I would say, and I think it answers both of those questions. So we do need to think about providing alternative solutions or alternative offers to the Africans on infrastructure, just because that's good market capitalism to have more choices. And the fact, for example, that data in Africa is very high relative to the rest of the world and is not going down, tells you that there's an absence of competition in many of these markets. But in some cases, it's not going to be the US. Now, maybe in a couple of years, if the Biden administration passes its infrastructure bill and we reinvigorate our infrastructure companies and roads and bridges, and maybe we will have more companies that will be involved. But right now, Bechtel is the largest American company when it comes, global company when it comes to infrastructure. It's in the top 20, and that's about it. So infrastructure is not going to be where we're going to compete with China, but we can be working with our European partners and with others that invest in infrastructure like Turkey and the UAE to create multilateral, multinational alternatives to China. So I think that we can do a lot in terms of working with our partners and the World Bank and the African Development Bank to counter and to provide options. I think that we should be focusing on what are, in this case, the U.S. strengths, which is on services, which is on agro-processing and technology. That's where we tend to be very competitive in Africa. And then this final point that one of the questions, one of the audience asked is so important, is that when China is under constraints, they can actually provide, or they can actually offer decent quality infrastructure. So there's a study from this, from the China Africa Research Institute at Johns Hopkins University that says that when China is under a World Bank contract, and that road is as good as any other OECD road. And we've seen the African Development Bank and the World Bank assign money and projects to Chinese vendors, but they also disqualify a lot of them for corruption and fraud. So we need to work with the Africans to make sure that if China is going to build a project, that it is responsible, that it is transparent, that it meets the standards that the Africans set. And I think by both creating more alternatives with our global partners, but also creating more constraints led by the Africans, I think we can minimize some of the most negative things that China does, although not all of them, and we need to be vigilant.
Thank you, Judd. The EU, so this is a question from Megan Richards. The EU has a quite detailed and ever closer relationship with Africa on a series of issues. So you already, gave a few pieces of answers to that question, but the question is, how do you see EU or Europe in US working together on same common issues in Africa? What are the, if you could have the top 3 issues where the EU and the United States should be working much more closely together, what would they be?
Yeah, for me, there's a couple of them. One is on climate, and it's a priority of many of the European countries and has been for a very long time. And now with President Biden, we're talking about climate. I think that we need to think about both adaptation and mitigation challenges that Africa faces, as well as thinking about the balance between between gas and coal. Those are still resources for Africa as they make their energy transition and come up with a policy that makes sense for African countries to meet them where they are. I think that we could be doing a lot more on trade. The trade picture right now for Africa is pretty complicated, right? So you have economic partnership agreements that many European countries are signing with individual countries. The United States has an FTA, a free trade agreement with Morocco, and is looking to do one with Kenya. We have unilateral trade preferences through AGOA. The Africans are working on their free trade agreement, which was implemented at the beginning of this year. Plus, China has just signed an FTA with Mauritius, and India has an EPA with Mauritius as well. So there's a whole mess of different trade agreements. And sometimes, let's be quite honest, they don't actually come up with the best options for everyone. They tend to privilege the nations that have signed it. So I'd like us all to take a step back and think about these trade agreements and how do we make them work for Africans, but as well as the Europeans and the United States, all of us who believe that there's a lot of opportunity to invest and trade with Africa. And the final one, no surprise, would be security. I think there is an important partnership between the U.S. and the Europeans, but in some respects, the architecture that we have isn't fit for purpose. It's a lot of all coming together and having chats, but not really a division of labor, a division of responsibility. I think particularly in the Sahel, I think the U.S. has and Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin have reaffirmed that we want to continue to support France in the Sahel. But I think we need to think about the other facets of the security partnership to deal with extremists, particularly the diplomacy and the development side, where we can think about what are the U.S. strengths, what are the French strengths, what are other European strengths, and then come together to reverse these trends, which now over a decade are going in the wrong direction.
Thank you. I'll try to regroup some questions that link U.S. domestic politics and U.S. policy in Africa. One has to do with the role of Vice President Harris. Do you see Vice President Harris as a possible White House lead on Africa in the context of constraints on President Biden's time, political capital? And the second one is looking at Congress. What are the main partisan divides regarding U.S. Africa policy? And on the contrary, what initiatives are most likely to enjoy bipartisan support? Does the polarization of U.S. politics affect the policy debate on Africa, or is it not enough a priority to trigger deep political disagreements?
Okay, I should have been writing notes down. So the vice president, it's already clear that she's a force multiplier. She reached out to President Tshisekedi of the DRC, who is also the AU president, and talked to him in part, I think, around the Horn of Africa during the transition in Tanzania. Following the death of President Magufuli, she called she called the new president, Samia Suluhu Hassan, to talk to her. And there's already been, even during the campaign, the vice president was doing a lot with African diaspora and around migration and immigration. So I think that she will be, and already has proven to be, a key actor in engaging on African issues. On Congress, the truth is, I think that bipartisan consensus continues to exist. There may be slightly different views on China and who is more hawkish than others, but Republicans and Democrats are speaking loudly about human rights abuses and democracy issues in Africa. And I would even say that that was true during the Trump administration. At the time, the Senate Majority Leader, Senator Risch, was very good at talking about problems in Zimbabwe and other countries. And that continues. We saw Senator Coons deploy to Ethiopia as an emissary of President Biden. So I think that they may sometimes come to on the China issue at a different way, but actually the outcomes are almost always the same. How do we increase trade and investment? How do we re-engage with the continent? How do we stand up for our values, our shared values around democracy and governance? What do we do to respond to threats in Mozambique and the Horn of Africa? So I don't see a lot of division between the different sides of the aisles. Again, sometimes different ways of entering into that conversation, but there's a really strong, committed senators and representatives on this topic. In terms of initiatives, there is a lot of thoughtfulness going on right now on how do we do trade investment better. And I hope that the Congress will pick up on the president's pledges on urbanization and provide a legislative backbone to whatever that initiative will be.
Thank you. I have a few questions on the African Growth Opportunities Act, the AGOA. So one of the question is asking, AGOA has been operated for a long time. How do you explain why U.S. companies are not taking advantage of AGOA to manufacture for the U.S. market as they have done in China? And then another related question is, could you please share your thoughts on the future of AGOA versus strong urge to conclude FTAs with Africa? If the US pursues more FTAs, would these be with individual countries, regions, or through the African Continental Free Trade Agreement?
Sure, those are great questions. US trade with Africa is less than 1%. AGOA has been important, but it is in some respects a relic because it is a unilateral trade preference. So it means that Africans can export items to the United States relatively duty-free. So it doesn't really do the same things around manufacturing that the question the audience member asked. I think there's a fairly good consensus that AGOA needs to evolve. It will expire in 2025, and there needs to be there's the very strong views that there needs to be new thinking about how do we go beyond GOA. And what that looks like, I think, is still undecided. At the end of the Obama administration, the US Trade Representative published a paper, which I thought was phenomenal, called Beyond AGOA, which gave a whole series of different options that one could think about, including what could we do FTAs with countries specific or with a continental free trade agreement, although that wasn't even in existence and really didn't have much momentum by 2016. So there's a lot of things that could happen. The way I think about it is that there's going to be a patchwork of different trade agreements. So there are going to be countries that are going to have something akin to AGOA for the foreseeable future. They just won't meet the standards that the US has for an FTA. There will be a continued effort to push out FTAs with countries that do meet those standards. And then I hope that we're going to lean in with the CFTA and figure out what we could be doing on a regional level as well. But that's the conversation that's alive right now, is figuring out, how do you think about these different trade agreements? How do we think about investment? How do we build on Prosper Africa?
Thank you. Then I have a few questions on more security and the climate security nexus. So one of the questions was, can you elaborate on any key intersections between national security and climate change? How do you think the Biden administration will approach environmental threats in Africa, especially from this perspective? And another one was to do with the counterterrorism security cooperation in Africa. Are there risks for the US trying to widen its security cooperation in Africa beyond counterterrorism when terrorism persists in Somalia, Mali, Nigeria, is growing in Burkina Faso, Mozambique, perhaps in DRC? What's the right balance and role for counterterrorism in US security cooperation?
Yeah, those are fantastic questions. I mean, I think the case is closed on climate change being a national security threat to the United States and to the global community. And there's plenty of reports at this point about how climate can contribute to violence, at least by the fact that, or conflict in part because it attenuates resources and creates more concentration as populations move closer and closer together, whether that's because of desertification or limited resources or flooding. So I don't know what the Biden policies will be around climate, but it's clear that they see it as part of a matrix of different challenges that they're going to have to navigate globally, but also in Africa. On counterterrorism cooperation and what is the right balance, I mean, by the time that you're deploying troops to these countries, in many respects, you are on your back foot, right? Some of the drivers of insecurity, of the receptivity to extremist ideology is already there. Of course, one of the biggest drivers is just governance and human rights abuses. A number of studies now show that ends up being what pushes people into the arms of extremist groups. And we can see that very clearly in what's happening in Mozambique, or what's happened in Burkina Faso, or in Mali, or in Nigeria. So I believe really strongly that the US military and the broader US system should be investing in a host of things that aren't kinetic. There was an exercise that the US State Department just had in West Africa where they were working with courts and police. I think that's really important. I think the US military should be very proud of the way it responded both to Ebola in 2013 and 2015 and now to COVID in terms of building field hospitals. So I don't know what the perfect balance is, but I tend to believe that the non-kinetic elements of what the US military does in partnership with the State Department and USAID are fundamentally more important and more decisive than kinetic attacks or targeted strikes, which may, decapitate a group or slow down a group, but doesn't change the dynamics that have led to their rise.
Thank you. And so linked to that, there are a few questions on more of the political governance issues in Africa and the role of the United States. So one was on, I can't find it anymore, so many questions, but it was how can the US play a role in all of these issues that are not just security, military, but that are dealing more with the political governance issues in Africa. And the other one was asking how can France and the US work together to promote and encourage African solutions to African problems instead of imposing external solutions that are inevitably seen by many Africans as a neo-colonial push for control of African resources, land, and people.
Yeah, both excellent questions. So on the democracy and governance front, the way that I like to look at it is that over the past 15 years, we've seen the landscape being quite unsettled by demographic changes, geopolitical changes, economic changes, technological changes. And so we have seen tremendous volatility around democracy and governance across the country. Just prior to this, I did an event at CSIS on the Freedom House report that showed great declines both globally, but in Africa. We're seeing more protest in Africa on economic and governance issues. I mean, twice the global average. We are seeing backsliding in what we thought were strong democracies like Benin. And at the same time, we're seeing upsets. We're seeing autocrats be thrown out or lose at the ballot box in the Gambia. We saw the legislature in Malawi rule against the ruling party following the election, and now there's an opposition leader in power. We just saw an election win in Seychelles. In fact, since 2015, there's been 34 peaceful transfers of power in sub-Saharan Africa. So we've got some really dismal results in West Africa, continued problems in Central Africa around democracy and governance. The story of Ethiopia of great hope and now some considerable despair around sort of the challenges in Ethiopia. At the same time, we are seeing other places that are surprising us. So what is the US going to do in that? If you think about that there's been an unsettling, you also have to recognize that right now the governing and the governed are kind of figuring out how far they can push. How do they mobilize? How do they use those tools? And then eventually, I think we will reach a new sort of status quo, or at least a temporary one. And the United States and the Europeans working with African civil society, opposition, journalists, as well as governments can be helpful there. And speaking out on the fact that so many countries shut down the internet last year, particularly around elections. And we saw that just recently in Uganda and in Congo Brazzaville, that there are 3 elections this weekend that almost certainly will not be free and fair in Djibouti, in Benin, and in Chad. And the French government did speak up against some of the attacks on an opposition leader in Chad. I hope the US government, who has already been very vocal about Benin, will continue to be vocal. But we need to be involved in their working and defending civil society. And I think that's really where it gets to this next point. Africans are going to lead on all of these issues. It's going to be citizens' determination that is going to change the direction of these countries. But the United States and the European partners can be reinforcements, can help bolster and shore up those efforts, can protect when there's a civil society leader who is being attacked or repressed or harassed. And I think that's really important. It's, Africans are going to be in the lead here, but the United States and others can be helpful to make sure that the norms around, whether it's third terms or candidate disqualifications or internet shutdowns or digital authoritarianism don't become cemented and concretized. And just a last thing is that the United States and European countries are also having some democratic problems. Like, let's be honest, we have some significant problems around identity politics, attacks on our institutions. The United States had the insurrection at the Capitol. So we have to do this with humility and not wag our fingers in a colonial or neo-colonial way, but pretty much say, we're all struggling to get this right. We are all unfinished. as democracies, we can learn from you as much as you can learn from us, and let's sit at the table and try to figure these things out.
Thank you, Judd. And so one of the linked questions to that is what tools should be used? What institutional changes, division of labor, defense, development, the 3Ds, diplomacy in the US government are required to address these complex crisis and security scenarios? And there is a specific question of the case of the Sahel.
Yeah, Chairman Meeks, who is the chairman of the House Foreign Relations, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, has 4 Ds. So he says democracy, diplomacy, development, and diversity as being our strengths. And I think that's really useful when both thinking about the multitudes that the U.S. contains in terms of different actors who can engage on Africa, but also looking at the global community. And so, I think, for example, on the Sahel, the Europeans and the French in particular are going to be leading on security. I think maybe, for example, the Scandinavians are very good at peace negotiations and peacemaking. I think proudly that the US is very good at diplomacy, particularly thinking about sort of an all society approach. But I think the most important places we need to be focusing on are journalism and on institutions. The reality is the coup in Mali last year was not that much about insecurity. I know that's how the Western media wanted to frame it, but it was really about nepotism and corruption. And it was about stolen elections or manipulated legislative elections. And so, we're all focused on security, but we have to think about where the Africans are and what is going to internally move them, and where are the tools to do that. So I think engaging with institutions, supporting civil society, and perhaps finding different envoys too, not just diplomats and politicians, but members of our civil society who can speak more candidly and connect more effectively than sometimes those of us in suits and ties can.
Thank you. And so we have a specific question linked to what you just said on, the African solutions to African problems. And we have a question on the micro entrepreneur. So Astrid Ries is raising that question. The engine for inclusive development lies in the millions of micro entrepreneurs throughout the continent, mainly youth, women. How can the United States refocus DFC resources to provide them with support financing instead of setting a minimum project viability with a price tag of $1 million, which basically favors corporations?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I wish there was someone from the DFC who could answer that, but let me take it to a different direction. That the U.S. government has said that we want to increase two-way trade with Africa. And then we have the DFC that focuses on, one of the many agencies that focuses on increasing development and also supporting U.S. businesses. I think we're never going to double two-way trade if we just focus on deepening what we're already doing. So the corporations that are working in Africa, the multinational ones, are incredibly important. But I do think that the American private sector, I'm taking a different angle on this question, could be doing a lot more. And it's a private sector, maybe different than the Europeans, that is pretty skeptical about the investments in Africa. They're squeamish, they believe they have other opportunities. And it's in our small and medium enterprises that we could have a lot more impact. And those small and medium enterprises could be great partners for African small and medium enterprises. So I think that there's a synergy there that we have missed. And I mentioned earlier about storytelling. The stories that we tell the American public about Africa are often very negative. And when they're not negative, they're over the top bullish. About how easy it is to invest in Africa and how well you will do. And that's not true to any business person, right? Everybody who is engaged in business, which I'm not, but knows that you meet challenges and meet obstacles and you navigate them. And then you find, where your sweet spot is. And so I think coming up with different ways to talk about private sector investment for American companies is important. I also think that not talking about every single investment in Africa as an impact investment is also important. So there's a whole bunch of narrative changes that we need to have. And perhaps we should be doing some more research around what would actually motivate people to invest in Africa, and then what are the partnerships, to your question, we can have with our African counterparts to sort of move these countries forward.
And so we have a last two questions that are related to science technology. One is asking, how would you describe the current states of U.S. Africa science technology research development collaboration? What are the key actions needed to strengthen meaningful collaboration with African partners on these issues? What is the role of science diplomacy? And linked to that is a question on the so-called tech wars. What is your take on the likely implications of tech wars, in particular as this relates to Huawei, which has been expanding its 5G infrastructure on the African continent, including in Kenya and in South Africa?
Yeah, that's a lot. That's a great question, very difficult. I will give you a partial answer to at least some of that. U.S., I think, has been a leader on science and technology as it relates to public health. In fact, if you look at most of our big announcements over the past year around the COVID-19 crisis, we talk about strengthening health institutions, laboratories. So, I think that has been a center of excellence for the United States when it comes to STEM. I see, if you look at some of the major multinational corporations that invest in Africa, they often do a considerable amount of apprenticeship for Africans and to become engineers and to move up the chain. And then it's really in our public-private partnerships around universities. There was a very small initiative under the Trump administration around public university partnerships, and we have the Young African Leaders Initiative, which was under President Obama. But I think we could be doing a lot more. If anything, COVID's taught us the importance of distance learning, or the necessity of distance learning, and what we're doing today on Zoom. And so I think the United States could be much more forward-leaning and thinking about how do we provide some of that STEM education just online with the primature of the U.S. government and U.S. institutions. I'd like to see, as we get out of a COVID world, a growth in both American campuses in Africa. We do have one in Rwanda from Carnegie Mellon and one from the American University in Nigeria, but I think we can do more there. And then opening up our doors to Africans to study in the United States, something that the Trump administration tried to stop. Here's a remarkable statistic: 20% of all African leaders, current sub-Saharan African leaders, studied in the United States. And it's more than $1 billion are created for American business when African students study in the United States. And as many of you may know, that China, second only to France, receives more African students than anywhere else in the world. So when I think about threats that China poses in Africa, I think about this education component a lot. We're just losing, or we're missing our ability to engage and inculcate and have a conversation and dialogue with Africans in the United States as students. And studying English is still the preferred language for Africans, according to surveys. On this last question, when I think about threats to the US when it comes to China, and I think about threats from China to African countries, it's usually in three bins. One is on critical infrastructure. Their control of ports, for example, 46 ports are being operated, built, or financed by China. Those are all done to military standards that prevent some real challenges for our companies, as well as our military, to be able to navigate across and into Africa. I think about, as I said, the soft power and people-to-people relationships. Right now, it's Chinese phones and Chinese streaming services that far outpace American and European phones and streaming services. And the last one is on tech. And I'm very concerned about the counterintelligence threats that Huawei and ZTE pose. In terms of 4G, it's about 70%. Huawei is about 70% of African 4G. It is likely to be 100% of 4G. Now, if you say to an African counterpart, the Chinese are going to spy on you, unfortunately, their response is, you do the same. Why should I care? So you can't really win the argument on counterintelligence. But I think you can win the argument on, if you only have one provider, your data will remain high and unaffordable. I think that's one. So we need to make an economic argument. Two, I think the U.S. government and the Europeans need to really work on investing in R&D. One, encouraging our companies to be involved in this opportunity, and then two, investing in R&D so we can minimize some of the threats that are posed by Huawei and ZTE. The Ivorians right now have a review board for where they review Chinese infrastructure investments. We know the UK briefly had their own review board for Huawei, and it won't be a perfect solution, but I'd like to see more African countries set up their own agency, their own review boards around this issue. And maybe that's a good point to sort of end this, is that ultimately the Africans are going to have to set the standards for what they expect of their partners. And I think that if the values are transparency and accountability, I think it will be a benefit for Africans, and it will be a benefit for the US and the Europeans. It will limit some of the Chinese investment, and those that are able to meet those global standards that Africans set, they'll be able to provide some goods.
Thank you, Judd. That's a great way of concluding this conversation. There were many other questions, but we could, I think, discuss for a few hours. There was also a Russia question, because we're talking a lot about China, but what about Russia, and how is the US perceiving the role of Russia in Africa? Is there a way for Washington and Moscow to collaborate or to cooperate in some ways in Africa? But I will forward to you many of the interesting questions that were left unanswered. I'm sorry for that, but 1 hour is short when you have an excellent speaker like Judd. So thank you very much, Judd. I think that was extremely fascinating and extremely interesting, and I think very helpful for many of us who are working. And I have the list of people attending, many of our great African experts in France and Europe participating in this discussion. So thank you again very much. And hopefully we'll see you again soon in the next GMF event. I want to again thank our partner, the U.S. Embassy in Paris, for making this possible. This is a great program to have some of the best U.S. experts explaining U.S. policies on many key relevant issues for French and European partners. So thank you for all of those who attended, and see you very soon. À très bientôt. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Judd.